Blake Robertson is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of English and Writing Studies at the University of Western Ontario. His dissertation investigates the censorship, revision, and publication of Elizabethan and Jacobean historical drama. He is also currently working on the Barnett Shakespeare Project at Western Special Collections. His paper today is called Freely Speak Thy Mind, the Case for Non-Censorship in Richard II.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to let you ever know that I'm speaking from Western, about 5 minutes from Western, which is traditionally located on the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wook, and Adawanda peoples, whose traditional lands I'm gathered on today, I guess, and we all are virtually. Shakespeare's Richard II holds a particularly important place in the study for early modern censorship. It's the only printed genre in which there is a majority critical consensus asserting the censorship in any of Shakespeare's plays. This is not always the case. Edmund Malone once wrote, it is, I know, commonly thought that the Parliament scene, as it is called, which was first printed in the quarter of 1608, was an edition made by Shakespeare after its first representation. But it seems to me it was written with the rest and suppressed in the printed copy of 1597. Where these claims that were commonly thought can be read, I do not know. I can find no record of this consensus amongst the very few 18th century critics. Malone may have very well been referring to the claims made on the title page of the 1608 edition. What I can find, largely thanks to the works of Charles Forker and Josephine A. Roberts, is a long trail of scholarship trying to justify why the play was censored, ever since Malone made his claim in 1790. I'm of course getting ahead of myself, but I wanted to foreground this paper with the notion that I'll be considering an alternative to an idea that has been held and only rarely contested for over 2 centuries. But let's talk about the play and the scene matter first. Richard II was entered in the Stationer's Register by Andrew Wise on the 29th of August in 1597. The play was likely written at least 2 years prior. Critics have conventionally used private correspondence that suggests a performance at the house of Edward Hobby on Cannon Row in December of 1595 to date this. Now, the print edition of Richard II was evidently quite popular. Wise published the work immediately after licensing in 1597 and then printed 2 more editions in 1598. It is Shakespeare's only play that was popular enough to have 3 print editions within 2 years. The play had then apparently run its course for the time being, as it was not printed again for another decade until 1608 by a different publisher and printer. Q4 stands out amongst the first, there's the first 3 editions for you there. Now, Q4 stands out amongst these first 4 editions for several reasons. For us today, and I'd like to talk about all these other reasons as well, but the important difference between Q4 and its predecessors is the appearance of the Parliament scene in Act 4, Scene 1. Now, 4-1 begins much like the first scene of the play, this time with Bolingbroke, usurper of the crown, resuming the trial investigating Gloucester's death. Bagot, one of Richard's flatterers who had escaped his compatriot's fate of execution earlier in the play, stands as both a witness and accused. Following several debates between the 2 parties, York enters to announce Richard's willful abdication of the crown. The missing 164 lines have Richard enter, and in his most elevated poetry of the play, give his crown and scepter to Bolingbroke in front of Parliament. Now, there are 2 variants of Q4's title page, one being an almost perfect facsimile of Q3 with different publication details, and one addressing the edition of the scene, which reads, as you can see here, the tragedy of King Richard II with new editions of the Parliament scene and the deposing of King Richard, as it hath been lately acted by King's Majesty's servants at the Globe. Now, minus a few outliers, most editors since Malone are hesitant to take Law's words, new editions, at face value. In fact, the critical majority asserts that the lines in question were written with the rest of the play in 1595 and subsequently censored when the copy text came from the licenser's desk. The editors of the New Cambridge, Oxford, Arden, all, albeit with varying degrees of certainty, believe that the scene was censored. A brief glance at any important critical editions of Richard II would have any reader believe that the jury is in on the issue. And there is good historical and circumstantial reasoning for this. Discussion of the next monarch in the latter half of the century, especially by Parliament, was a dangerous endeavor, and anxiety over her waning reign had Elizabeth hampering any public discussions of possible successors. As Janet Clare notes, the ecclesiastical authorities, the master of revels at the time, who was Edmund Tilney, or a specific representative of the Privy Council may have recognized the dangerous potential in depictions of rebellion, usurpation, and regicide and struck it from the page. However, much of the evidence for censorship operates from the long-held assumption of a clearly intentioned and efficient censorship system, an assumption that has come under fire recently from critics like Richard Dutton and Cynthia Clegg. These new understandings in Elizabethan and Jacobean press practices demand that we reconsider some of the traditional arguments supporting censorship and see if it deserves the merit it's held for so long. Andrew Gurr states that there is only negative evidence for the non-censorship argument. And there are several reasons why this is also the case for the censorship argument. I'll discuss just two of those reasons today. The first one being that we don't have sufficient data to suggest any sort of strict regulation of historical dramas during the period to suggest the scene was a cause for concern, and many texts that contain similarly seditious material were printed. And the second part is that the scene is thematically and dramatically cohesive with the rest of the play without those missing lines, despite the critical majority's assertion that 4-1 suffers from inconsistency without Richard's entrance and speech. If Richard II was censored before making it to the press, it would seem odd that there was only one scene cut from the play text. In fact, the material evidence of Playhouse censorship that we do have, those wonderfully understudied Playhouse manuscripts like Sir Thomas More, Second Maiden's Tragedy, and Sir John Van Oldenbarneveld, just to name a few, suggests they were probably many cuts. If the text was looked over by a censor, it seems odd that they would cut only the Parliament scene. In fact, what seems most glaringly censorable is the depiction of a successful rebellion. Any text depicting this subject was explicitly outlawed as treasonous in Elizabeth's proclamations of 1570. Moreover, the text depicts the legitimate monarch as tyrannical and stages his execution in the penultimate scene. Yet the only scene that the allegedly espoused concern, is Richard's innocuous abdication. That the censor narrowly suppressed one scene in a sea of proclamatory infractions is counter to conditions suggested by the historical and material data available. Press licensing and censorship during the late 1590s was largely unsystematic and often contrasted with or ignored the official legislation it was supposed to enforce. The licensing of text for print fell into the purview of the Stationers' Company, and it is traditionally held that the company's interests coincided with state concerns. However, as Clegg and Edward Arbour suggest, the company was an entity entirely separate from the Queen with an entirely different set of interests. The monarchy would use monopolization of the trade to taper the flow of printed material and also keep an eye on potentially seditious material. However, when considering the level of austerity with which company agents would scrutinize a work before granting a license, we must not operate under the broad assumption that a licensor is infallible or, more importantly, a direct agent of the Crown. Even if they were, only around 50% of the texts printed in Elizabethan England are officially licensed. In the words of Clegg, in practice, press control was largely reactive rather than proactive, even though its mechanisms were well defined. And at least between 1558 and 1603, censorship was an ad hoc response to offensive religious and political discourses rather than a regular tool of government hegemony. The large gap between the legal language and the execution of that language is not negligible, to say the least. The censorship argument demands that we assume that the play was a special case in which the government took interest. There's no record of an ecclesiastical censor in the Stationers' Register, and at the time, the Playhouse censor had nothing to do with print licensing. Again, if this was the case, then what specific event was the censor reacting to that demanded their special attention? And if the text was potentially incendiary, why was the only episode of fairly innocuous lines censored while the rest remained untouched? Why was the text even licensed? Certainly, the strongest argument for censorship is the one that Clegg herself makes, that the authorities had a problem with the scene's implication that the Commons wield the power to destroy and make the monarch, that authority should be decided by a free election of the Parliament. Clegg's argument focuses on the Queen's concerns with parliamentary discussion over her successor, Dolman's conference of a next succession, and Northumberland's line at the beginning of the censored episode, which says, "May it please your lords to grant the Commons suit," and his continued assistance throughout the scene for Richard to read the articles against him, and thus legitimizing his deposition through the authority of parliamentary power. Clegg bases the argument on several proclamations by the Queen and her Privy Council that were specifically concerned with suppressing parliamentary discussion over her successor. If the concern was Parliament's active role in Richard's deposition, then why were so many works left untouched by the censor's hand that detailed that episode? Numerous historical accounts of the event were printed. Just to name a few, Hall's Union, Stowe's Summary of English Chronicles, Stowe's more comprehensive Annals, Abridgment, Grafton's Chronicles at Large, and Holinshed's Chronicles, both versions in 1577 and 1587. Now, I will say in two of the texts, the emphasis on Henry's forceful succession bolsters the notion that Stowe and Grafton may have been trying to circumvent the topic of common election, or that authors may have been subject to strong recommendations for omission in their historical recollections of the material. However, if the authorities did have a hand in these abridged histories of 1560s, this hand seems elusive by the end of the decade. The larger histories by Stowe and Grafton depict Parliament playing a pivotal role in Richard's abdication to Bolingbroke. Stowe portrays Bolingbroke offering Richard up to London's population, saying, "When the Duke came within 2 miles of the city, the Duke caused the horse to stay, and then said to the commons of the city, 'My masters, behold here your king, and consider what you'll do with him,' and has the Archbishop persuade them to proceed the election of the new king," followed by a long description of the Parliament's electoral process. Similarly, Grafton details Parliament's acceptance of Richard's abdication to Bolingbroke, writing, "Then the lords, hearing this claim, commented secretly among themselves, and then it was demanded of them what they thought, and they all agreed to the said claim, and that he was worthy to reign as king over them." Holinshed's Chronicles, which, despite documented censorship after 1577, keeps the taboo matter in the later edition of 1587. In both editions, the author emphasizes Parliament's advisement and ultimate authority in Richard's deposition, stating that the unfortunate king finally came into his adversary's hands and was deposed by authority of Parliament, and then was said that the Duke of Lancaster admitted to reign in his place. The Chronicles leave no room for interpretation. These words are a clear breach of the allegedly censorable material. The majority of these historical texts closely engage with the subject of and parliamentary involvement in Bolingbroke's ascension. Monarchic relations with Parliament may have been officially subject to censorship when Richard II reached the licenser's desk. However, the sheer amount of uncensored historical texts printed in numerous editions indicates little concern for the subject generally. In truth, there is no positive evidence to suggest that the issue demanded suppression. The only texts containing this matter which were subject to stern legal action were R. Dolman's Annexed Conference and John Hayward's The First Part of Life and Reign of King Henry IV. And that is because there are explicit connections to the Earl of Essex, which are irrelevant to the scene of Shakespeare's play. I want to talk about that today too, but there's no time. So Clegg suggests that these texts were not censored because they were all licensed well before the issue reached its boiling point in the 1590s. But it should be noted editions of them were printed throughout the decade. And one only need look at The Scourge of Villainy, first published in 1598, Scalethea, also published in 1598, to see that if necessary, and more often than not, censorship would happen after the texts were already in circulation. So this shouldn't have posed a problem if it was one. Now, the other strong motivator for the censorship thesis is the Abbot of Westminster's utterance at the end of 4.1. Censorship critics suggest that the full line, "A woeful pageant have we here beheld," at 4.1.3.2.1, right after the missing scene, must refer to either the absent lines or, far less likely, the Abbot of Carlisle's arrest immediately prior. Dawson and Yakin's conclusions serve metonymically for the censorship party, stating that proponents of the view that the deposition was added later regard Westminster's line as a reference to the arrest of Carlisle, but the latter's response, "the woes to come," hardly seems consistent with that interpretation. Moreover, the word pageant is much more suitable to the elaborate show that Richard and Bolingbroke have just been enacting than to the rough but not especially theatrical arrest of Carlisle. This argument does have traction if one assumes Westminster's statement as a direct reaction to Carlisle's arrest alone. However, when one views Westminster's words as a commentary on the dramatic action of the entire scene, accounting for Bolingbroke's deceptive actions in tandem with contemporary usage of the word pageant, his line seems appropriate. The word pageant was often used to denote dissembling. It means a part played by someone in a situation, and a performance intended to deceive and trick. Shakespeare, more often than not, employs this use of the word in several of his plays. One example being Ulysses' speech about Achilles and Patroclus in 1.3 of Troilus and Cressida, stating, "When slanderer he imitation calls, he pageants us, rebuking the Myrmidons for acting unlike themselves in protest to Agamemnon." Like the fleet-footed dissembler, Bolingbroke in his new role puts on a performance for Parliament to highlight his superiority and imminent accession. The imitator king plays officious judge, attempts to suppress a duel, bag it for thou shalt not take it up, and appears magnanimous when claiming he will repeal all charges against Norfolk and return his lands, title and lands. As Dover Wilson notes, Bolingbroke is probably already aware of Norfolk's death, and his lavish elegiac reaction, "Sweet peace conduct his soul to the bosom of good old Abraham," indicates a suspiciously performative behavior of the heir apparent. The laconic pragmatist feigns to be a symbol of ornate regalia, akin to Richard, a dramatic transformation signaled by his opening words, "Now, Bagot, freely speak thy mind," which directly echo Richard's line at the beginning of the play, "The accuser and accused freely speak." Bolingbroke adopts the lofty role previously played by the extravagant Richard in order to affirm his position as the rightful successor to the crown. Considering Westminster's political position, then, it is no surprise that he utters woeful pageant as soon as Bolingbroke leaves the stage. Additionally, the prophetic imagery and poetic cohesion of Carlisle's words are upset by the addition of the Parliament scene. Carlisle's prophecy following Bolingbroke's line, "In God's name I'll ascend the regal throne," loses dramatic impact by Richard's intrusion. The bishop objects to Bolingbroke's claim that the absent Richard should be judged by subject in inferior breath, and he himself not be present, and upon these grounds foretells of future events. Carlisle employs the play's recurrent garden imagery to prophesy that the blood of the English will manure the ground, depicting the War of the Roses, pitting the houses of York and Lancaster in the woefulest division prove that ever fell upon this cursed earth. His call to future generations, where kin and kind will confound one another, emphatically ends in a rhyming couplet with a plea to prevent it, resist it, let it not be so, lest child's children cry against you woe. Carlisle's emotional state reaches its zenith in a chillingly accurate portrayal of the events to occur throughout the next three plays, and the tetralogy already written. Northumberland's response, labeled by Wells as comic bluntness, acts as an appropriate counter to the bishop's warning and is emblematic of the new authority's diminishment of the potential consequences impelled by the breach in ritual of proper succession. If Richard then enters to deliver his most dramatic performance of the play, the emotional charge and garden imagery sustained through Carlisle's rhymed response to Westminster, "The woes to come, the children yet unborn, shall feel this day as sharp to them as thorn," becomes stale and loses the emotional magnitude achieved at the end of his prediction. Richard's interruption downplays the dramatic effect of imminent prophetic fulfillment, following Northumberland's heedless disregard of Carlisle's words, a fulfillment signaled by a quickly budding conspiracy. The scene, without the abdication section, plots out the narrative sequence for the rest of the tetralogy. By viewing 4-1 without Richard, taking note of Bolingbroke's dissemblance, and allowing the continuation of Carlisle's colorful poetics, the reader perceives events to come, where the Henrys take up Richard's phaetonic role and lose grips of the reins to their kingdoms as it falls into disorder. To be perfectly clear, I'm not necessarily saying the text was never censored. Whether we will ever know if it was would require we probably find a manuscript. The reason I dispel these arguments and make a case for non-censorship is the positive evidence we do have suggests the scene was added later or removed at a different stage in the process before print. Censorship arguments require us to jump through many hoops to figure out why the play was censored, as if the question of if the play was censored has a definitive answer. The question should be more open-ended. Much like some of the theories posed by new bibliography, a narrow pursuit of the censorship thesis prevents research into the potential insight we can gain about Playhouse revision and the complicated and collaborative processes these unstable texts underwent in their journey from foul paper to folio. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. That's wonderful.